Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Halion 7 tutorial series. Today we're going to have a look at recording our own samples using the dedicated sample recorder. Hope you're enjoying the series so far. If you are, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. Great way to support my channel. So here's the challenge for the day. We have an external instrument. This is Arturia's Emulator 2 plugin. And that's the sound that I want to import into Halion today. Now there's only one thing I need to do to this external instrument before I can close it down and we don't need to look at it again. And it's basically to disable velocity sensitivity. I want to record this instrument at something approaching a flat level because I'm only going to be recording one sample per key. I want that sample to be as loud as possible, so velocity sensitivity is not my friend. Now this is obviously an instrument by instrument thing, but this velocity control here, if I turn that all the way down to 0, however hard I hit the key on the keyboard, it's always going to generate a note of exactly the same volume. That just gives me a nice flat line to play with. I can now close the polybrute down. I'm not interested in that instrument again. And now we can just concern ourselves with Halion. So how do we get the signal from that Emulator 2 plugin into Halion? We use a feature called sidechaining. At the top of the Halion interface, you've got this button called Activate or Deactivate Sidechaining. If we turn that on and then click the cog symbol immediately to the right, we have the opportunity to read incoming signals from external devices. If I click this Add Sidechain Source button, I now have all of the audio outputs that are currently in this project. And if I now select Emulator 2, Halion can now hear the output from this device. I'm just going to set the output level to 0 dB so that we've got the full strength signal. Whatever's coming in, we're going to record, and we close that down. We route this sidechain into Halion using our input source. Now I've already got it pre-selected because I was preparing for this video earlier, but basically you want to make sure it's input. That's your sidechain input. Now technically speaking, that's all we need to do. If I select the emulator plugin itself to make that the active instrument and press a key on my keyboard, you can see there's an input. Another way to do it, if you've got the Halion instrument selected, is to monitor enable your external device. So it will basically now listen for MIDI triggers, MIDI notes on my keyboard. All it needs to do is generate the sound. There are multiple different ways that you can do that in Cubase. So here I've got Halion selected, monitor enabled the emulator, and again, that signal is going to find its way into Halion. So we're now ready to record. As far as the configuration is concerned, that's all we need to do. There are 2 pages worth of setup options that we need to go through today, but I just want to get to the stage where we've recorded a sample, so I'm going to do this very simply and then I'll undo it and show you in a little bit more detail what's going on. I'm literally just going to press the record button, then press the key on my keyboard, and then press the record button again, and that's that done. That sample's been recorded. You can see we've got this big long tail where I was talking to you before I pressed the key. Here's the note, and then I arbitrarily stopped the process by pressing the manual record button. So let's just have a look at what's happened. This zone has been added to the program. It's not in a layer, it's not particularly well organized, but it's there. If I select that zone, we can now jump over to the edit screen. Here's the sample. We can set our sample start point to get rid of that silence at the beginning before I press the key. Now I'll disable monitoring from the emulator so that we don't hear that instrument. Let's just have a listen to what Halion's got in its memory. There it is. So we've successfully recorded sound from an external device, in this case one of our other plugins, but it doesn't matter, any audio will suffice. And we've stored that recording as a wave, in a zone, in Halion, and now we've got the full feature set of Halion to play with. Let's do another one. I'll click undo enough times to get rid of that recording. This time I'm going to record the signal from my microphone. That's a live signal currently input into my system. It's actually activated via the control room, but it really doesn't matter. If I have an audio track and I monitor enable that track, you see that this is the input to this audio track is the main mic. And now you can see as I'm talking, boo, this is good vocal training for your tuning. Can you hit a correct pitch? I'm not going to do that. Let's get back over to the recorder. Now my input source is still the sidechain, but this time I don't want to take my input from the emulator. Instead, I want to take the input from this audio track. So this audio track is listening to my microphone, it's monitor enabled. The output from this audio track is going to get routed into Halion. Boo, and there you can see the input level on the track, proving that everything's fine. Now let's record a sample from my microphone. Wow. I'm just trying to keep everything as simple as possible at the moment. Let's listen to that microphone recording. Wow. Let's throw that one away. So hopefully at this point you're comfortable with the idea that any input, any audio input can be routed into Halion using the sidechain. Every single active audio output anywhere in Cubase is available as a sidechain input, and we can access it from this window. Let's go back to the emulator example and now do something a little bit more constructive. Okay, what I want to do is record that synthesizer sound over a 2-octave range. I'm just going to record the white keys and I'm going to make Halion fill in the black keys for me. I want to do it in a structured and ordered way, and at the end of the day I want to have a library of samples available to me that I can do anything I want with, so I want to maintain as much control over it as I possibly can. The first thing that I'm going to do is create myself a layer, and I'm going to call it Polybrute, after the name of the preset that I'm importing. I also want to ensure that those sample wave files are stored in my project folder. I can worry about moving them to my primary sample folder later. I just want to maintain complete control of it for now. Let's jump over to the Options tab, and there's a button here that's currently and by default grayed out. I'm going to activate it. It says Project, and if we hover over it, you'll see that it says Record to Project Audio Folder. Let's have a look where those samples are going to end up. This project that I use for my Halion tutorials is called Test, and here is the Halion subfolder. Now I've done some prep for this video before, so that's why the Halion folder already exists. It won't until something actually gets recorded into it, but this is where the samples are going to end up. All of these file settings are important. You'll need to review them when you're doing any recording. The channel is going to tell you whether or not it's stereo or mono. I'm always going to take my feed from the input, so pretty much always leave that as source. The sample rate, again, is set to whatever my project is. Now the sampling bit depth defaults to 16-bit. I like to record at 24-bit, so let's set that. And I'm happy recording my files as WAVs. The file naming scheme is an entire language in its own right. I'm perfectly happy using the default. You're going to have the word record, and then it'll add whatever key I've pressed on the keyboard. So if I press C3, you'll see record space C3. The zone template has some basic audio parameters that we want to set. There's a template in Halion called multiple samples import. That's a nice one to select. What it's basically going to do is give you headroom. So if you record all of your samples at 0 dB and you press a chord, then because you're playing multiple notes simultaneously, it's highly likely that the sound is going to exceed 0 dB. So the multiple samples import template is just a good kind of basic default that will give you headroom, that will allow you to record multiple samples. If you want a little bit more manual control, again, you can see various headroom settings, including panning laws. That's beyond the scope of today's discussion, really. Multiple samples import is going to serve us perfectly fine for today. Playback mode, we're going to leave as normal. Whatever you select in this is basically just going to be a default. This is what's going to get sent into the sample editor once you've done all of the recordings. If I change this to loop, then it'll simply enable looping by default. You can always change these options later. Auto trim is something I usually set to 0 crossing, so when it's recording the samples, it's just going to adjust the start and ends very slightly to ensure that they're at 0 crossings, minimises the likelihood of little pops appearing on your audio. And then you can choose whether or not to auto normalize. If you do, it's simply going to boost the gain so that the sample is played back at 0 dB. None of this is destructive. I can't stress this enough. The wave is going to get recorded as the wave, end of chat. These values will simply be applied to the sample editor. I'll leave auto normalize off for today so that we're going to basically record exactly what's coming in. That's all of the options in the options tab. Back over on the main tab, we've got some decisions to make here as well. Now I'm going to be recording a 2-octave span here, so I don't want to record a single sample. By selecting auto next, what's basically going to happen is every time I press a key on the keyboard, Halion is going to step up to another higher pitched key, ready for me to press that note again. You'll see this demonstrated very shortly. A very important sibling option when we choose auto next is where do we start. This next key option will basically be hanging around from whatever I've previously done. I'm going to set that to C2 because that's the lowest note I intend to sample. I'm going to sample from C2 to C4. Now then, once I've pressed C2, what's the next thing I want to happen? Well, if I choose chromatic, I would have to step up every single note, and that's totally fine if you want really high quality, high fidelity samples. Sampling every single note of the synthesizer is totally fine. For today's purposes, I'm going to give a slightly different demonstration because I'm just going to choose the white keys. I'm going to sample all of the white keys and then get Halion to fill in the gaps in between. Speaking of which, how do we want it to fill the gaps? In this particular case, it doesn't really matter because no note is ever going to span more than 2 semitones, but fill-centered will serve you perfectly well the vast majority of occasions. And now some really important options at the bottom of the window. How do we want to record this sample? Now, the 2 examples that I've given you so far were manual. I pressed record, I did something, and then I pressed record again. But we can make Halion be a little bit cleverer than that. We can set an audio threshold, and -30 is a really good default. Depending on the sensitivity of the thing you're recording, obviously apply a bit of common sense here. But what it means is that basically silence is going to be ignored. The moment Halion detects input signal, it'll start recording. How do we want it to stop? Well, let's have a lower audio threshold. -50 is a little bit loud for my liking. I normally set it to either -60 or -70. We'll go for -60 today. So once the incoming signal drops below this level, recording will stop. Now that we're relying on amplitude, audio volume, to control our recordings, we need to be a little bit careful about transient control. If you have something very sharp and snappy like a drum hit, you don't want to miss that stuff at the beginning of the sample. Basically, Halion might not be able to catch up quite quickly enough. If we engage pre and post, we can specify a period of time. You can see it defaults 100 and 500 milliseconds respectively. That will arbitrarily be added on to the beginning and end of the recording. Something really important to note, however, is that when the sample's being recorded, whatever that audio threshold is, the -30 dB, that's where the sample start will be set. So we're now using sample start and end markers inside our WAV file to determine where the sample's actually going to be played from. Now that's an awful lot of talking. Like I say, there are a lot of options to set up. It's a very intricate process that we're going through here, but we are fully armed and good to go now. I can record 2 octaves worth of this keyboard, and we're going to generate a bunch of samples that we'll be able to use to recreate this synthesizer. Let's do it. Press record. And here's C2. Because I disabled velocity sensitivity on my master instrument, I don't have to worry about hitting the key at any particular volume. It's going to generate a full signal for me. Now I'm going to step up to D2. Have a look at what the next key says. See, it's automatically incremented and it's waiting for me to press D2. I'm holding the key down. This note happens to have a descent to sustain 0, so it's not going to sustain indefinitely. If you're sampling a note that does sustain indefinitely, you're going to have to decide when to let the key go. I'm not going to get into that today because that's all about tailoring your release cycles and just being a little bit intelligent about what it is you're actually trying to record. So this is a relatively straightforward example, but it's really nice. You can see that even though I'm still holding the key down, the signal dropped below the audio threshold, it stops recording, and it's automatically adding all of these samples into the layer that I've asked it to. Now it's going to be a bit tedious to watch me record all of these samples, so I'll record the rest of the notes off screen and meet you shortly. Okay, that's the full 2-octave span recorded. I can now come out of record mode and we're done. Let's have a look at these WAV files in our project audio subfolder. Here they all are in the Halion subfolder. I'll now be able to copy those into my master samples directory and they'll be available for future projects. I'll just turn the emulator's monitor off as well, don't want to hear that. So here's the C3 sample. You can see the period of silence at the beginning. The sample isn't right at the very beginning of the audio file. It's been set properly to where the threshold was met. I press play. There's the sample. Let's have a look in our mapping table. So I've zoomed in here so that we can see the 2 octave spread. You can see a big zone, or 2 big zones to the left and right. That C2 has been spread to fill as much of the keyboard as is necessary, but the 2 octaves that we're interested in have been properly populated. So here's the D2 sample that was recorded, and it also spans to D sharp. E2 only has a single key assigned to it, and then here's F2, obviously covering 2 semitones again. So if I play this keyboard now, we have a polyphonic representation of that emulator synthesizer. There's my D sharp, or E flat. So I didn't record all of these notes, but Halion has filled in the gaps. What I'm going to do now is a little bit brutal, having recorded all of those notes and they work perfectly well. I'm going to throw them all away. And instead, I'm going to import those samples from the folder. We're not going to get back to where we are at the moment, because when I import these samples, you're not going to have that sample start point properly identified at the -30 dB. In other words, the 100 milliseconds of lead-in time that we had on each one of those samples, that's basically going to be carried across. But not to worry, let's get them imported first. I'm going to right-click on the layer, and I'm going to say Import Export. Import samples, and here are all of our audio samples. So I'm going to select them all, and then we have some options down below that allows us to be a little bit intelligent about how these samples get imported. Again, none of this is destructive. This is basically just your starting point, and you'll be able to edit all of this stuff in Halion if you need to. But as you can see, the mapping options are pretty self-explanatory. The key range is root key fill centered. That's what I specified when I was recording the samples, so we know that this is going to work. The root key itself is going to be taken from the sample name. This is an advantage of putting the key of the note in the sample file. That'll determine where the key gets assigned to on the import process when it's recorded into Halion. Now, it's important to say most WAV files, most tonal WAV files, have a pitch embedded in their file. That's something that you would be able to select as well from sample file. But in this case, I'm going to use the name because I can see they're all there. We didn't do anything with velocity ranges, so I'll leave that from sample file. And I'm now going to say open. And now it's imported all of those samples into Halion. It's not particularly intelligently ordered. When we recorded them, they went from C2 up to C4. This time it's ordered them alphabetically. But the mappings are correct. If we zoom in far enough to be able to see them all, as you can see, all of those mappings ascend chromatically correctly. And so if I play the thing, you might be able to hear me hitting the key and then hearing the sample. That's the 100 seconds of lead-in. And here it is. Now, unfortunately, there's no auto trim feature inside the sample editor. There is in the recorder to have it do that process for you, but by analyzing the audio. But once you've got the sample in your editor, you've got a couple of options on how to get rid of this silence if it's annoying you. Obviously, the brute force method, pick up your set sample start, move it to where you want. That's going to work absolutely fine. Another option is to trim the sample. This is a bit fiddly. You basically need to select the bit of the sample that you want to keep. So if I scroll all the way to the right hand side and zoom out, you can see that I've now basically selected everything I want. I can then click trim sample, and that'll throw away the silence. Let's undo that. So yeah, auto trim would be pretty nice at this point, but it doesn't exist, so you'll have to do it manually. If you know of a better way to trim these silences from the beginning of the samples, I'd be intrigued to know. Put it in the comments below, but I've not been able to find one. Anyway, that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.